Hello, this is Rosemary Armao bringing you this week's segment of my podcast and Armao on the Brink. We're talking to Brian Bonner this week, an American editor working in Kyiv. Remember Kyiv, Ukraine? There's a war going on there. We seem to have forgotten about it with Trump and Harris and events here. The war is raging on and has now gone into Russia. We're going to hear more about what that means for the United States and the West. While we in the United States seem to have lost interest or focus in Ukraine, you have focused on it totally for at least the past year, 2.5 years since the war has been going on. Were you surprised by the counteroffensive, Brian? It was billed here as unexpected. Supposedly Russia did not expect it either. And yet the Ukrainians seem to be accomplishing what their counteroffensive last fall did not do at all. They are moving into Russia. What do you think of it all?
I was surprised and very impressed, but if you go back to all through the history, even just since the big war, as Ukrainians call it, since the
Right.
full-scale invasion, we've had a lot of black swan events. We had um, Ukraine retaking Kiev, Kharkiv. We had the Prigozhin march, aborted march on Moscow. We've had a lot of things. And this is one more, and it really changes, I think, the narrative. I hope it changes the end of the war in a way that's favorable, or influences the end of the war in a way that's favorable to Ukraine. Don't think we know that yet because we're a week in. Conflicting reports how much territory they have. Ukraine says they're on the march. Russia says, of course, they're stopping them, and Ukraine, there'll be a limit because Ukraine doesn't have the logistics, network to keep marching. But I think it's pretty effective what they've done so far, and I think the biggest, if nothing else, it showed the West what Ukraine is capable of doing, how inventive and how resourceful they are if they had only been giving the weapons they needed from the start of this conflict.
Did F-16s have anything to do with making a difference this time on this push?
I'm not sure. I imagine they did, but I don't know. Apparently, from the reports I've had, and the fog of war is pretty thick here, but electronic jamming. You know what I think is that they took very good notes about the Prigozhin march,
Right.
Prigozhin, and they also had this dissident group, exile group called Free Russia that has been working in this territory. So obviously they had some great intelligence. Obviously, Russia did not expect that this would take place, and it's laughable, all these protests that Russia is registering over this incursion.
Yes, the terrorism that there has been afflicted upon them. There is an interesting piece in an opinion piece in the New York Times that we were talking about before we went on the air, written by Anastasia Edel, if I'm saying her name correctly, Edel. She is a writer about Russia, and
Right.
her view is that the West now is getting a taste of what might have happened if they had not treated war in Ukraine like a localized conflict in which they had few obligations. If they had taken it seriously, if they had imposed sanctions that really hurt Russia, if they had sent aid on time and insufficient supply, if they had just acted like this was a major world conflict, it could have ended before now. And all that's really happening, she alleges, is that you're setting up Ukraine's position to be a little more positive when peace talks begin. And many people think that Russia will go in and just get exactly what it wanted, 20% of Ukraine's territory, and guarantees that it won't go into NATO. That's possible, huh?
That would be a terrible scenario for Ukraine. I'll tell you why, because it isn't it isn't a territorial dispute. It is a dispute. It is Russia's, war to vanquish Ukraine as a nation as part of its war against the West. I mean, dictators hate democracy. So and the other thing with negotiations, people bring this out all the time. I can solve the peace. Who's going to enforce it? who has ever enforced any agreement that Russia has made? What agreement related to
Exactly.
Ukraine has Russia ever lived up to? None whatsoever. So I think that argues for, unfortunately, a very protracted war. Her doomsday, it could still end badly. It could end acceptably. It could end badly, and it still could end catastrophically for Ukraine, um, if the West cuts it off, and the trends don't look great, but they never have until the West analyzes and assesses what the consequences are of not punishing Russian aggression. And there's a lot of credibility at stake for the United States, for Europe, for NATO on this
Yeah,
conflict.
that is true. How is Zelensky doing politically and within the country these days? Is there still great support for him? Is he still the hero?
Well, my view on that is that the Ukrainians have decided to put a lid on politics and of course, elections until the war is resolved, hopefully amicably or favorably to Ukraine. But there's tension bubbling up and there's dissatisfaction bubbling up with Zelensky's leadership and his team,
Hmm.
and reports of corruption popping up here and there. My guess is that Ukrainians are going to, let him and support him because he's done a good job in the war. Not perfect, good job. But after that, I predict he'll be voted out at the
Out
first
of office.
possible opportunity. And let me say, he's been really, really a tremendous advocate for Ukraine, I think, at the world stage. But he's missed some things, and made some big mistakes. And one of the biggest mistakes was the manpower issue. There's
Hmm.
no way that Ukraine is going to be able to become a big Israel or keep fighting Russia, because it's not going to end with Putin. It's going to the
It'll go
empire.
on. Yeah.
Yeah,
This will go. The age now for draft is only down to what, 25, whereas a nation at war, shouldn't it be 18? Is there discussion of that within the country?
it should be. It should be 20 at a minimum. That discussion is bubbling up. Noe Verme had an article with a member of parliament who also served in the military saying it's got to be 20 to 50. They cannot achieve their aims, I don't believe, and a lot of people, it's not what I believe, it's what a lot of
Right.
people who know uh, say to be true. They can't achieve their aim with what they call the old man's army. They have, with an
Hmm.
average age in their 40s, it's not going to be enough. They're outnumbered anyway. Moreover, besides that, they need to show the world that they're putting every able-bodied man that they can get into the fight. And in every country, that's at least 18 or 20 and no higher. And I think that's going to help win political support because the world will say, hey, these guys are really fighting for their country and everybody is doing it.
Right.
Um, but that requires us, the Western allies and Ukraine, to arm and train them properly so they have a chance of surviving the war. This is a really big, big, big problem. I think, all these stories coming out about the lengths to which men are going to evade military service, not good. And I think the biggest, critics are obviously the members of the current armed forces who
Right.
are tired, have no end date on their service, and who are outnumbered. And they need,
You just can't keep going on that way. You
they can't
just
keep going
cannot.
on. And that's the other thing. I think other events like this incursion into Russia, would be a lot easier if Ukraine had a steady supply rotating in of healthy, armed, trained troops to
Hmm.
keep the fighting or keep the defenses fresh.
Okay, so defects in the way Ukraine is waging the war, defects in help, very unreliable that the U.S. and the rest of the West has sent. How about Putin's misstep? We're painting him as the big winner and victor here, but he suffered some losses too, including the revelation that his army is not as powerful as we once thought, that he has some vulnerabilities. The internal Russia seems to be quite unprotected these days. Does that hurt him at all, or do you still see him as strong as he was, 2.5 years ago when this all began?
I don't think he's strong. I mean, as strong as he was 2.5 years ago. We've seen, you know, you and I in the world
Hmm.
have seen too many of the weaknesses. The whole thing was a miscalculation, a blunder, strategic mistake. His whole idea that Ukraine is not a separate nation, and that's been
Right.
proven correct. And moreover, what you said is, their army, and they clearly have command structure, leadership problems, and they're able to paper it over because they still have 3 or 4 times the population of Ukraine, which is
Exactly.
rapidly losing population, but they have a demographic crisis as well. And the other way you can tell that they're under stress is they're really raising the monetary reward to recruit more soldiers. And this is being
Hmm.
done in a dictatorship, authoritarian society. They're paying Moscow soldiers up with bonuses up to $60,000 a year. That's substantial until you calculate the fact that you're probably going to get killed if you go to Dunbar.
What is life like these days now after 2.5 years of war? We're hearing a bit about worker shortages and blackouts and the destruction of all kinds of infrastructure. What's life day to day like in Kyiv?
Well, I'm really worried about the winter. We had a period where we only had 4, 6 hours of power. This is a society under tremendous stress. And I don't want to, I probably going back in the last century, the Holodomor is where Ukrainians suffered the most. 4 million people starved to death so that the rest would politically submit or just surrender to Stalin's ways. It worked. Ukraine, I think, in many ways, is still recovering from that. And this time, this is going to take a long time to recover because we have 6 million people abroad. Many of them are going to stay abroad until the war is over, and many of them are not going to come back. We have a demographic crisis. We had the fewest number of births uh,
Mhm.
in decades, 187,000 last year. It should be a million. Three
Wow.
deaths to every birth. The nation is hugely stressed. It's not clear how long they will be able to keep fighting if they do not get substantial amounts of Western aid. The economy is under big stress. I mean, you know very
Mhm.
well that the teachers and the pensions, a lot of that money does come from the West, so that Ukraine can route, or spend most of its tax money, uh, or as much tax money as possible on defense industry arming themselves. And there are some bright spots there, but even when the finance minister recently rolled out a proposal to hike taxes, which is essential, there was blowback from the business community. That surprised me very much. Now, not to say that, they said, well, you should stamp out the shadow economy and et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
Yeah, all that needs to be done, but they're a nation at war, and they're gonna have to do more. Um, I'm still gonna live there. It's hard to live there, but they're a nation at war, and they're gonna have to do more for themselves. Waiting for a congressional appropriation, whether it comes, when it comes, how much will be in it, and EU funding is a dangerous way to live, as
Wow.
they find out.
As you found out this past year. A big question here, Brian. How do you assess the American election in terms of Ukraine?
Well, most Ukrainians I know, because of the experience that they had with Donald Trump in the first term, do not want him in. Uh, They will never say that publicly, and they shouldn't, because they need bipartisan support, which they have been getting. That's one of the great things Ukraine has been getting consistently. They need to change Republicans' minds, like Mike Johnson, the
Mike
House,
Johnson.
who underwent that transformation from blocking aid to saying Putin must be stopped. So they need all that. They need to stay out of it and to be seen as staying out of it. But nobody I know wants Trump in. Now, Trump is, and I had actually interviewed Professor Alexander Moidel of Rutgers University today for my latest podcast. He doesn't say it's likely, but there is this thought that if you look at U.S. support for Ukraine, there's three positions basically: isolationists, forget about Ukraine, we don't care. There's the middle of the road, and I say that's the Biden position, and then there's the hawkish position, which is give Ukraine everything it needs to win this war as quickly as possible, without restrictions, without hesitation, without qualifications. That lane is empty politically. I mean, there are Trump supporters like Mike Pompeo and other, what you would call the historical Republican hawks, who are advocating that. And some think that even though Trump doesn't care about Ukraine, he does care about his ego and not being seen as being defeated by Putin. And he would, as president, have to face the consequences of if Ukraine is defeated, and we're a long way from that, but if Ukraine is defeated, he would be the one who has to face the consequences of Russia on March, on the march.
Brian, we have run out of time. I want to thank you for this. And we conclude our podcast. As you know, you've been on before with the toast. And so today's toast is to you and to, I hope, what will be an easier winter than you're expecting in Ukraine. And to the good guys, I hope they win.